Hey guys, tonight we journey into the harsh world of medieval Europe, not to admire its castles or chivalry, but to uncover something grittier, more unsettling. While the Middle Ages gave us cathedrals, manuscripts, and legends, they also brought relentless struggles that would break most of us within hours. From brutal hygiene and merciless laws to the daily fight just to stay alive, life back then was anything but romantic. Before you settle in, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, maybe brew some tea, and let's slip back into a time you probably wouldn't survive. Most women gave birth alone or with untrained midwives. Imagine yourself in a modest dwelling, the walls made of wattle and daub, the air thick with the scent of smoke and damp straw. The hour is late, and outside the narrow doorway, the night presses close around the village. Within, a woman labors alone, or perhaps with only a single neighbor or a midwife whose training has come not from any formal schooling, but from years of watching and assisting other births. For much of human history, this was the most common beginning of life. Most women, regardless of wealth or station, brought their children into the world without the presence of a physician. In many places, doctors were reserved for the wealthy or were simply too far away to be summoned in time. Even when they could be reached, there was little they could do to change the natural course of labor. Tools were rudimentary, and understanding of infection was non-existent. Midwives were often older women of the community. Their expertise was built slowly, experience layered upon experience, the knowledge passed down through quiet instruction and shared stories. They relied on observation, on intuition, and on methods that today might seem quaint or even dangerous. A cloth soaked in warm water might be laid across the woman's abdomen, believed to ease the pain. Herbal infusions could be offered to calm the mind or encourage contractions. Some midwives murmured prayers as they worked, invoking saints or familiar spirits to safeguard the mother's strength. The scene of childbirth was at once ordinary and momentous, a rhythm of life that repeated itself countless times across generations. A small fire might be kept burning to soften the chill. Candles or rushlights flickered in the gloom. The woman's breathing set the pace, rising and falling as each wave of pain drew closer together. There were no antiseptic scents, no sterile gloves. Instead, the air was layered with the warmth of bodies, the dampness of the floor, the tang of sweat and fear. Should complications arise, there was little that could be done beyond offering comfort and prayer. A baby turned the wrong way might prove fatal to mother or child. Excessive bleeding was a peril with no remedy beyond the crude attempts to staunch it by hand. Even in the best of circumstances, the ordeal carried the ever-present risk of death. Yet for the community, this uncertainty was simply part of the pattern of existence. Life began and ended in the same simple rooms, surrounded by familiar faces, the cycle unbroken. In wealthier households, there might be more attendants, a better-built chamber, and finer linens. But even among the nobility, birth was attended by many of the same anxieties. A lady of the manor might be surrounded by a circle of female relatives and servants, her husband waiting anxiously in another room, excluded by custom. A physician might be present, but even he could do little beyond watching and advising. The science of obstetrics, as we understand it, would not emerge for centuries. It is easy to forget, in our age of brightly lit hospitals and carefully monitored deliveries, that childbirth was once among the most dangerous passages in life. Each birth was a gamble against fate, a quiet struggle behind closed doors. The stories of those hours are often absent from chronicles and records, overshadowed by wars, treaties, and coronations. Yet they shaped the fabric of society as surely as any king's decree. Some communities developed elaborate customs to guard the process. In parts of Europe, iron objects might be placed beneath the bed to repel malevolent forces. In other regions, a cord tied with specific knots was believed to ease the labor. These rituals blended the practical with the symbolic, offering a sense of control where none truly existed. When the baby finally arrived, the outcome was announced by the midwife's quiet declaration or a single cry that echoed through the house. If the birth was successful, neighbors might gather to bring warm broth or bread. If not, there would be hushed condolences, and life would turn again to the daily labors that never ceased, no matter who had been lost. Imagine the relief that must have flooded the mother when the danger had passed, when the first uncertain breaths gave way to a steady wail. The child would be quickly wrapped in cloths and placed close to the mother's skin, a moment of peace after the long ordeal. The midwife might wash her hands in a basin of water darkened by the work. A candle would burn low, its light catching the rough surfaces of the walls. There was no guarantee of safety in the days that followed. Infection could set in with quiet persistence. The mother's strength might ebb away without warning. But if she survived the first week, the family would begin to hope in earnest. They would speak of names, of godparents, of the life that stretched ahead. The rhythm of their lives was shaped by these moments of waiting and hoping, of labor and recovery. Each child born this way connected the generations, an unbroken chain of memory and endurance. Even now, in many parts of the world, childbirth retains echoes of this past. Though technology has transformed the experience for many, there remain countless women who bring life into the world without modern assistance. The details may differ, different herbs, different prayers, different customs, but the essential vulnerability remains unchanged. In the quiet of the village dwelling, where the fire has burned low and the night has settled in, you can almost hear the slow, exhausted breathing of mother and child. The midwife gathers her things, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Outside, dawn approaches with the promise of another day, another struggle, another chance at survival. It is a simple truth, repeated across centuries. Birth was both a beginning and a risk, a moment that bound a woman to all who came before her and all who would follow. 1 in 3 mothers died giving birth. Imagine yourself in a small, timber-framed house, the walls lined with rushes and the air thick with the scent of smoke from a low fire smoldering in the hearth. Outside, the world continued in its steady rhythm, fields to be tended, animals to be fed, tasks to be completed from dawn until darkness. But within these quiet walls, the most precarious moment of a woman's life often arrived without warning. Childbirth, in centuries past, was not a brief medical event behind sterile curtains. It was a profound ordeal shaped by centuries of custom, superstition, and the simple fact that survival was never assured. 1 in 3 mothers would not emerge alive from this experience. The figures varied across cultures and centuries, but wherever you look, the risk remained a quiet shadow. In the medieval period, the midwife was often the most important figure in this drama. She might be an older woman from the village, respected for her knowledge of herbs and the practiced way she could soothe a laboring mother's fears. Her hands carried a lifetime of experience. She knew which prayers to murmur under her breath and which poultices to prepare. The midwife's tools were simple: clean linen if it could be spared, a knife to sever the cord, and a wooden bowl to catch the afterbirth. Though humble, these tools and rituals carried immense weight. Without antiseptics, even a small injury could lead to infection. Blood loss was common, and there were no transfusions waiting in the next room. Instead, women relied on rest, warm compresses, and whatever nourishment their families could provide. Imagine the quiet urgency in that dimly lit chamber, the midwife's voice, low and steady, the mother's breathing coming in strained waves, the flickering lamplight illuminating anxious faces. If labor was prolonged, there were few remedies beyond patience and hope. Some families believed that untying knots in the house would help the baby emerge more easily. Others placed religious icons by the bedside to encourage divine intervention. No matter the culture, no matter the time, a shared sense of helplessness often settled over the household. Blood loss was perhaps the most dangerous threat. In a time before understanding circulation or sterile practice, a mother could slip away in the space of an afternoon. Those who survived the birth sometimes succumbed days later to what was simply called childbed fever, a sepsis caused by bacteria that no one yet understood. The only certainty was that this silent enemy could strike without warning. Despite the risks, childbirth was woven into the fabric of daily life. A woman might bring new life into the world while her other children waited just beyond the curtain, whispering or playing, aware in some instinctive way that their mother's survival was not a foregone conclusion. The rhythm of their lives continued. animals still needed tending, bread needed baking, and the fire needed feeding, even as birth and death lingered together in the same narrow room. To soften the fear, rituals marked nearly every step. In many European villages, it was common to prepare a lying-in room. The shutters would be drawn, the air kept warm, and the mother confined to her bed for weeks after the birth. Neighbors might bring broth, gifts of bread, or small tokens for the baby. This period of seclusion was meant to guard against illness, but it also offered a measure of dignity and care in a time when medicine itself could offer little. The presence of women, mothers, aunts, sisters, created a sense of continuity. Each of them knew what it meant to watch the tide of life and death rise in the space of a single night. They shared songs and stories while they waited, their voices weaving a quiet spell of solidarity. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes, all their vigilance could not tip the balance. Consider also the strain on the families left behind. A widower with several children faced grim choices. Infants needed a wet nurse or an older sister still too young to understand the burden placed on her shoulders. The loss of a mother could unravel the fragile structure of the household. Yet communities adapted, creating support networks that eased the immediate crisis. Over time, some cultures developed elaborate ceremonies for commemorating mothers who died in childbirth. In parts of early modern Europe, special burial rites recognized them as martyrs of a kind, women who had given their lives in the service of family and continuity. Gravestones sometimes bore symbols of a broken rose or a sheaf of grain, quiet metaphors for a life cut short. Even among the wealthy, childbirth offered no true safety. In noble households, physicians might be summoned, but their knowledge was often no more effective than a village midwife's. Wealth could buy cleaner linens or better food, but it could not always stave off infection or ease a complicated delivery. A queen on her throne was as vulnerable as the peasant in her thatched cottage. Over centuries, incremental improvements appeared. Midwives began to adopt cleaner practices, instruments were boiled, and eventually, physicians learned that hand-washing could save lives. But for most of history, the same precarious pattern repeated generation after generation. Imagine the quiet hush that followed a successful birth. The new baby swaddled and resting near the mother, exhausted but alive. Outside, dawn would rise over the village roofs, another day beginning much like the last. Yet for that family, the world had been remade overnight. The risk had passed, until next time. This was the rhythm of their lives, a constant struggle to welcome new life while holding death at bay. A struggle faced by countless women who knew, each time they felt the first pains of labor, that their fate lay beyond their own control. In the end, their stories remind us that progress often arrives so gradually, it is almost imperceptible. It is easy to forget how recently childbirth became something that most women survived. And how much of that safety rests on knowledge and practices once unimaginable to the generations who came before us. As you drift further into thought, perhaps into sleep, you can imagine the countless mothers, midwives, and families whose quiet courage filled rooms just like the one you pictured. Their struggles were hidden behind closed doors and shuttered windows, but they shaped the fabric of everyday life in ways still felt today. Families didn't name babies for weeks. In the quiet hours after a birth, a medieval household would often slip into an uncertain stillness. Imagine yourself in a small, timber-framed room where the air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and fresh straw. A woman rests on a simple pallet, exhausted, her skin pale with strain. A newborn lies nearby, swaddled in coarse linen, small chest rising and falling in slow, uncertain rhythms. For many families across centuries and cultures, these first days were marked by a watchful patience rather than celebration. Unlike today, when a baby is often named within hours, it was not unusual for parents to wait days, weeks, or even months before bestowing a name. This delay was not mere superstition or neglect. It was a quiet acknowledgement of how fragile life could be. In some European villages, baptism might happen quickly, but even then, the name given at the church was sometimes provisional. The baby might be called simply the child, or referred to by a diminutive term of endearment, a tiny bundle who had not yet proven they could survive their earliest trials. Infant mortality was woven into the rhythm of life in pre-modern societies. Records from parish registers, carefully penned in faded ink, show that as many as 1 in 3 infants would not live to see their first birthday. In some places, the number was even higher. The reasons were many: infection, malnutrition, a chill caught in the drafty rooms where fires struggled to warm every corner. Parents who had already buried tiny bodies learned to keep their hearts cautiously distant. In Scandinavia, there was a saying that a newborn belonged more to the realm of spirits than to the realm of the living until they survived a certain span of weeks. Until then, the baby hovered in a space between. And so, families waited. They waited to see if the baby's cry grew stronger, if their eyes began to focus on faces, if their skin took on the reassuring glow of health. Only then did parents allow themselves to speak the name aloud, as if naming would root the child firmly in the world. This custom was not limited to Europe. In parts of Asia, similar patterns emerged. Some Chinese families delayed naming ceremonies until the child reached 1 month, marking the milestone with a quiet feast. In these traditions, the baby's first days were considered a time of transition, a period when the boundary between life and death was thin, and each dawn brought renewed hope that the fragile bond would hold. If you picture yourself walking through a medieval village on a cold morning, you might see mothers standing at the doorway, cradling infants in their arms. They would not call out the baby's name to neighbors passing by. Instead, they would nod silently, offering a look that blended pride with a trace of dread. Even when the baby had lived long enough to be named, the fear never truly disappeared. Each cough, each fever, was a reminder that survival was never assured. The practice of delaying names had another, quieter purpose. It created space for mourning without the burden of too much attachment. In households where several children might not live past infancy, parents could not afford the full weight of grief each time. By holding back the name, they held back a measure of sorrow. It was not that they did not love the child, only that they had learned to ration their hope. Over time, churches began to encourage earlier baptism, partly out of theological concerns. In many Christian communities, the sacrament was believed to cleanse original sin, and delaying it risked the child dying unbaptized. Yet even when baptism happened soon after birth, naming remained, in many cases, a separate, more personal commitment, one that waited for signs of resilience. Imagine, now, the moment when a family finally decided it was time. A father lifting his infant, feeling the surprising heft of a child who had begun to thrive. A mother, her face still lined by fatigue, speaking the chosen name in a hushed voice. The name might be that of a saint, a grandparent, or a sibling lost before. Sometimes, the name itself carried a protective power, a belief that to name was to shield. Naming ceremonies often became small, hopeful celebrations. A table laid with bread and cheese. Neighbors coming to bless the child, offering gifts of cloth or coins. The baby, at last, was fully acknowledged as part of the household, their place secured among the living. The fear never vanished entirely, but the family allowed themselves to hope more openly. Over the centuries, as medicine improved and survival rates rose, the practice of waiting gradually receded. In time, official record-keeping required births and names to be registered promptly. The slow, uncertain wait gave way to more immediate declarations of identity. Yet in some rural areas, the old customs lingered. Today, it can be hard to imagine such a guarded approach to new life. Modern hospitals, sterile and brightly lit, give an illusion of certainty. But if you look deeper into the quiet histories of ordinary families, you find a different story. A story in which survival was always provisional, and naming a child was an act of both love and courage. As you drift into thought, consider how this simple act, waiting to name, revealed so much about the rhythms of the past. It was not merely a delay but a recognition of life's precarious beginnings. In these small acts of caution and hope, generations left traces of their deepest fears and their quietest forms of resilience. So, if you find your mind wandering now, let it drift through those timber-framed rooms, where the first days of a baby's life were measured in quiet vigil, in breaths counted through long nights, in the patient, unspoken promise that tomorrow might be more certain than today. And in that slow unfolding, a name would finally arrive, as gentle and inevitable as the dawn. Children were buried without ceremony during epidemics. Imagine yourself standing in a small medieval village, its thatched roofs huddled close along narrow lanes. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. You can almost hear the slow, resigned footsteps of those who move from house to house, carrying burdens too heavy for any generation to bear without bending beneath the weight. During times of epidemic, plagues that arrived on the backs of fleas or in the breath of a neighbor, this quiet settlement would be transformed. The familiar rhythm of life, marked by the tolling of the church bell, the chatter of market stalls, and the gentle bleating of livestock, gave way to an unfamiliar silence broken only by coughing or muffled weeping. When illness struck, it did not distinguish between age or station. Whole families vanished in the span of days or weeks. One of the most haunting realities was how quickly the living had to become accustomed to death. Children, so recently welcomed into the world with hopeful prayers, were sometimes carried out again before they ever learned to walk. The custom of baptism soon after birth was often the only formal blessing a child received. When disease spread faster than the priests could manage, even that small rite might be delayed or performed hastily without the usual candles and prayers. The burial of children during epidemics often unfolded without ceremony. You can picture a shallow trench carved in the frozen soil, its edges lined with straw or torn linen. The bodies of infants and small children were laid there with little more than a whispered prayer or the hurried sign of the cross. There was no procession, no tolling bell to mark their passing. In times of crisis, grief was crowded out by necessity. Imagine a priest, shoulders stooped beneath the burden of so many losses, moving along the rows of the sick and dying. He would offer what comfort he could, but there were never enough words to meet the moment. Records from these times often speak in simple phrases: buried without rites, buried in haste, buried together. These entries are stark reminders that the rituals designed to ease sorrow simply could not keep up with the demands of survival. Beyond the walls of the village churchyard, hastily dug pits became the resting places for those who died when the gravediggers themselves fell ill. In larger towns and cities, entire fields were given over to the dead. They were sometimes called plague pits, unmarked, unblessed, and quickly forgotten by all but those who had no choice but to remember. The presence of these burial grounds shaped how people thought about life and death, and about the thin boundary between them. Yet, even amid such hardship, families tried to preserve dignity where they could. A mother might wrap her child in the same swaddling cloth that had once protected the newborn from winter chill. A father might carve a small wooden cross or whisper the baby's name before placing the tiny body in the earth. These quiet acts were sometimes all that stood between memory and oblivion. For many communities, famine often accompanied plague, compounding the sense of helplessness. When fields lay fallow because there were too few hands to tend them, hunger and disease fed one another. In these times, the burial of children blurred into the ordinary demands of endurance. Imagine the weary, unspoken agreement among neighbors. Today we bury them, tomorrow we go on living, because there is no other choice. Still, in the midst of sorrow, the village tried to carry on. The hearths were stoked, bread was baked when there was grain to grind, and the surviving children were gathered close to protect them from the invisible forces that had stolen their playmates. Even as the graves multiplied, so did the quiet determination to reclaim some semblance of normal life. Occasionally, chroniclers of these years wrote about the landscape itself, how the ground, softened by so many fresh diggings, seemed to hold a memory of all it had received. The earth became an unwritten ledger of loss, marked not by headstones but by the knowledge that entire generations could vanish in a single season. When the crisis receded, these burial grounds were sometimes tilled over or left to grass, a hidden testimony beneath the returning green. Over time, survivors found ways to commemorate the children who were buried without ceremony. In some parishes, memorial masses were held months or even years after the epidemic had passed. Bells rang belatedly, names were read aloud, and candles flickered in the memory of lives that had ended almost before they began. These gestures could not change the past, but they allowed families to feel that, in some way, their children had been seen and mourned. When you look back across centuries, it is easy to focus on the great events, wars, dynasties, discoveries. But here, in the small, nearly invisible stories of ordinary people laying their children to rest without witness, you glimpse the deeper truth of history, that it was built from moments of quiet perseverance as much as from grand triumphs or calamities. Imagine yourself walking slowly along the edge of such a forgotten field, where wildflowers have sprung up amid the soft mounds. The air is still, the sky a pale wash of color before dawn. In this place, there is no monument to mark the losses. And yet, you sense that the memory of those children endures, held in the soil, in the worn pathways, and in the faint echo of lullabies that were never sung. As you continue your evening or drift toward sleep, let yourself remember the resilience of those who lived through these times. The rhythm of their lives was shaped by cycles of hope and loss, of planting and harvesting, of welcoming and letting go. And though so many goodbyes were hurried, the quiet love that inspired them has never truly disappeared. Girls were married off before they turned 14. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit hall, the walls lined with tapestries depicting saints and ancient lineages. The air is cool and faintly scented with beeswax from the candles that gutter along the long wooden table. Here, the elders of a noble family sit in careful deliberation. Their voices are hushed but steady as they arrange the marriage of a child, sometimes a girl of 12 or even younger. The practice, while unsettling to modern sensibilities, was woven tightly into the rhythm of life in many medieval and early modern societies. It was a transaction as much as a union, a way to secure alliances, merge estates, or settle old rivalries. For many families, a daughter's marriage contract was considered a vital asset. In some regions, dowries were prepared almost as soon as a girl was born. Cloth was set aside, jewels appraised, and negotiations quietly begun long before the child understood what the arrangements meant. A girl's worth was often measured not by her hopes or intellect but by the strategic value she brought. You can imagine the quiet pressure in households where fortunes hung on a signature sealed with wax. While it is tempting to picture every young bride as a noble heiress in fine velvet, the reality was more varied. In rural villages, parents arranged unions for their daughters before their teenage years, motivated by simpler concerns. The need for more hands to tend the fields, the chance to unite small plots of land, or the hope of relief from the burden of feeding many mouths. In these settings, the ceremonies were humbler, a gathering at the parish church, perhaps a shared meal of bread and broth, and the blessing of the local priest. Yet the expectations were no less binding. Picture the day of such a wedding. The morning air cool against the skin, the dew still clinging to the grass outside the chapel door. The girl's hair would be carefully braided, her best tunic laid out, and the hush of the household deepening as she stepped into the role decided for her. Often she did not fully grasp the implications. There was no conversation about affection or choice, only a matter-of-fact acceptance that this was how life proceeded. In wealthier circles, these arrangements grew more elaborate. Documents were drawn up in Latin or the vernacular, detailing every item included in the dowry, from parcels of land to bolts of fine linen. Witnesses were summoned, scribes recorded each promise, and the transaction was solemnized with ritual. The child, meanwhile, might stand quietly to one side, her gaze fixed on the floor, absorbing the muffled voices that determined her future. Over time, the customs varied across regions and faiths. In parts of Europe, the church established minimum ages, often 12 for girls and 14 for boys, though these were not always strictly enforced. Even when the marriage ceremony was conducted early, cohabitation sometimes waited until the bride reached puberty. Yet even this small concession could not erase the sense of inevitability that shadowed these unions. Imagine yourself in the courtyard of a modest manor, where a young bride arrives at her new home. The wooden gates creak open, revealing rows of curious faces. Servants, relatives, perhaps even strangers come to witness this passage from childhood into a world of unfamiliar duties. She is shown her chamber, the walls cool and bare except for a carved chest holding her new household linens. The air smells of stored grain and old rushes, and the hush is broken only by the scuff of feet on the worn floorboards. For these girls, daily life shifted almost overnight. One day, they might have been sitting on a low stool, shelling peas alongside their mothers. The next, They were responsible for tending the hearth, overseeing supplies, and presenting themselves as the lady of the house. Some adapted with quiet resilience, learning the rhythms of their new life without complaint. Others carried an unspoken sadness that surfaced only in the small moments, an unfinished embroidery, a tear hastily wiped away before anyone could see. The consequences of early marriage were profound. Childbirth posed risks that modern medicine has largely alleviated. For a young girl, still growing herself, pregnancy could be perilous. Many did not survive it. Others emerged frail or permanently unwell. Yet these dangers were accepted as part of life's precarious bargain. Over time, women's bodies bore the silent record of the decisions made on their behalf. Occasionally, the historical record preserves glimpses of the girls' voices. In legal petitions or letters dictated later in life, you find a measured, careful tone. Some asked for annulments, citing abuse or desertion. Others simply described their circumstances in plain language, as if to assert that their lives mattered beyond the transactions that shaped them. These fragments are precious, reminders that behind each name in a marriage contract was a person with private hopes and fears. As centuries passed, reforms slowly emerged. The Enlightenment brought new debates about consent and the rights of children. Laws began to stipulate minimum ages more consistently, and social attitudes gradually shifted. But the change was neither swift nor universal. Even into the 19th century, early marriages lingered in some communities, their justification woven into economic hardship or the need to maintain social status. Imagine yourself at the threshold of such a household, the door slightly ajar. You might hear the quiet rustle of cloth as a girl tends to the fire, or the muffled cadence of a lullaby sung to a child not much younger than herself. The rhythm of her days, once marked by childish play, now measured by chores and obligations. She might glance out a small window, watching the fields turn from green to gold, and wonder if life could have unfolded differently. Those centuries have passed, the traces remain, in parish registers, in property records, in the inherited customs of families whose ancestors once struck bargains over a child's future. The stories are quiet but persistent, like an echo in an old hall. They remind us that history is often shaped not only by kings and wars, but by countless unseen decisions made around humble hearths and candlelit tables. And so, when you picture the medieval world, allow yourself to linger on these smaller scenes. A girl with a garland of herbs in her hair, her expression composed but inwardly unsure. The low murmur of voices finalizing arrangements she cannot fully understand. The simple meal served afterward, the bread and ale that sealed a promise. These moments may seem distant, softened by time, yet they hold a quiet power. They speak of resilience, adaptation, and the human capacity to endure the shape of a life decided long before understanding ever dawned. Fathers could be gone for years in wars or crusades. Imagine yourself in a small stone house, its walls cool to the touch even in summer. The hearth is cold this morning, and the smell of damp wool lingers in the corners. A woman bends to lift her youngest child, her movements deliberate, practiced. She has no way of knowing if her husband still lives. For many families in medieval Europe, this quiet uncertainty was a constant companion. When a father left to fight in a distant war or join a crusade, he might be gone for years. Letters were rare. News traveled slowly, carried by merchants or returning soldiers who often knew little beyond rumors. Each passing season brought no clarity, only the steady erosion of hope. These departures often began with solemn ceremony. A village might gather to watch men muster in the square, their armor gleaming if they were wealthy enough to own it, or patched and worn if they were not. Children clung to their fathers' cloaks, too young to understand how long the parting could last. Some men departed in the name of feudal obligation, a lord's call that could not be refused without disgrace or punishment. Others left believing it was their sacred duty, compelled by sermons and promises of salvation. The crusading ideal painted visions of glory and spiritual reward. Yet the reality was often far less certain. Disease could sweep through the ranks long before any battle was joined. A minor skirmish, a fall from a horse, or a fever contracted in a foreign port might end a life as surely as any blade. For those left behind, these possibilities lingered in every silence. In some regions, a wife of a departed man could manage the household in his absence, assuming legal rights over the property. She might supervise the harvest, arrange leases, or negotiate small debts. Yet her authority was always provisional, contingent on her husband's return. Should he die without witness or written record, she could be left in limbo, unable to remarry, unable to claim widows' rights or inheritance. It was not uncommon for entire communities to carry the weight of these unknown fates. In a single village, multiple households might be waiting for news, each woman keeping watch for any messenger who could confirm a death or deliver a final letter. Over time, practical concerns pressed forward. Fields had to be tended, animals fed, children taught the work that sustained them. Life did not pause for grief that could not be proven. For the children, their father became a story, someone glimpsed only in memory or in the few objects he left behind. Perhaps it was a small wooden carving, a belt, or a scrap of cloth embroidered with a family crest. These tokens became touchstones of identity, reminders that there was once another hand to guide them. In some households, stories about the absent father grew into legend, tales of valor, of piety, or of kindness that gave shape to the void. Imagine the months stretching into years, each harvest marking the slow passage of time without news. A boy might take up his father's tools before he had grown tall enough to wield them comfortably. A daughter might learn to manage the household accounts, her mother's quiet instruction preparing her to shoulder responsibilities she never expected. If eventually word came that a father had fallen, perhaps in a pitched battle far from home or in some nameless skirmish, it was often delivered by a man who could offer little more than a brief description and a few consoling phrases. There was no official death certificate, no pension, no formal recognition of the family's loss. In many cases, there was no word at all, only the long silence that settled over the household like a heavy cloth. Poverty was a frequent consequence. Without a man to claim wages or manage feudal obligations, families could lose their land or slip into debt. In some areas, lords granted limited protections, but these were not guaranteed. A widow might remarry out of necessity rather than affection, seeking security for her children and the chance to keep a roof over their heads. Among the nobility, a crusading husband's absence could carry different challenges. Estates were larger, and management required trusted stewards and careful oversight. A lady might spend years corresponding with clerks and reeves, trying to ensure rents were collected and obligations met. Yet even wealth could not dissolve the worry that her husband might never return, or that distant conflicts would claim the family's fortunes as well as its patriarch. The church sometimes offered solace, promising spiritual rewards for sacrifice and loss. Priests might remind families that those who fell in holy wars were assured salvation. Yet such words could feel remote when weighed against the hunger and uncertainty of daily life. Imagine the rhythm of their lives, shaped by absence as much as presence. Each evening, the fire would be banked low. Children would ask quiet questions. When will he return? Will he know me when he comes home? There were no easy answers. Only the steady resolve to carry on, to harvest grain, to mend fences, to prepare for winter without knowing if another pair of hands would help. Sometimes, a man did return, aged and altered by years of hardship. These homecomings were moments of relief and strangeness. A child who had grown tall in his father's absence might feel like a stranger. A wife who had managed alone so long could find it difficult to share authority again. Reunion was not always simple joy. It was also the work of knitting separate lives back into a single household. In this way, the absence of fathers during wars and crusades left lasting marks on families and communities. It shaped children who grew up without a familiar voice to guide them. It hardened women who learned to navigate the world's demands alone. It created a quiet network of loss that stretched across villages, connecting those who waited, wondered, and finally learned to endure the not knowing. Even now, in the quiet hours before dawn, you can almost imagine the hush that settled over the house, the soft crackle of the dying fire, and the slow, steady breathing of a family that learned to wait without expectation. Giving birth meant choosing between baby or mother. Imagine yourself standing in the doorway of a modest room, the walls lined with woven mats to keep out drafts, the floor scattered with clean straw. A single candle flickers on a low table, its glow illuminating the worried faces gathered around the bed. For most of human history, childbirth did not simply mean welcoming new life, it also meant confronting a choice no one ever wished to make. When something went wrong, midwives were often faced with a grim reality. It might be possible to save the mother, or to save the baby, but not both. This dilemma was not rare or exceptional. In many eras, it was a familiar pattern that haunted every family. For all their skill and experience, midwives were constrained by the limits of the time. No antiseptics, no anesthesia, no reliable surgical interventions. Instead, they relied on instinct, inherited knowledge, and prayer. When labor became obstructed, when the baby could not be born naturally, the room would fill with an almost unbearable stillness. Every voice dropped to a whisper. In some cultures, special tools were kept wrapped in cloth, only unrolled when all other hopes had been exhausted. Long, slender hooks and blunt instruments were used to attempt to deliver a child who could not emerge on their own. Each tool was intended to save one life, even if the other had to be sacrificed. The decision was not made lightly. Imagine the midwife's hand resting briefly on the mother's shoulder, the quiet words exchanged, the understanding that survival now rested on choices no one wished to contemplate. The tension in such moments was more than medical. It was spiritual, cultural, deeply personal. Families sometimes believed that to prioritize the baby's life was a moral imperative, while others believed the mother must be spared to care for her existing children. There were no universal rules. Each community developed its own customs, its own quiet codes about what should be done when the impossible arrived. Imagine the laboring woman, exhausted, aware on some level of the decision taking shape around her. The air would be thick with the smell of sweat and damp linen, the soft rustle of hands preparing instruments. Sometimes, a priest or spiritual healer would be summoned to offer last rites, even as the midwife continued her efforts. This mingling of hope and resignation created an atmosphere unlike any other, a place where the line between life and death was not so much a boundary as a shifting, uncertain space. When it was decided that saving the mother must come first, the procedure could be brutal by modern standards. Midwives or surgeons might attempt to remove the child in pieces, a practice that spared the woman's life, though she would often carry deep physical and emotional scars. If instead they resolved to protect the baby at all costs, they might attempt to force delivery in ways that placed enormous strain on the mother. Many times, neither survived. Even the most experienced practitioners knew they were often powerless against nature's momentum. Yet, despite these dangers, communities found ways to honor and care for those caught in this struggle. Special burial rites were sometimes reserved for mothers who died in childbirth, marking them as women of uncommon sacrifice. Babies who perished were wrapped carefully and buried with tokens, small cloth dolls, herbs to guide their spirits, and tiny carved charms. These gestures did not ease the loss, but they offered a framework of meaning in a world where outcomes were so often beyond anyone's control. For the families left behind, grief was accompanied by practical concerns. A widowed father with other children faced choices about wet nursing and remarriage. A surviving mother who had lost her child endured her own quiet mourning, often returning to her household tasks long before her heart had begun to mend. The rhythm of daily life did not pause for sorrow. Fields needed plowing, animals needed tending, bread needed baking. So life pressed forward, even as absences lingered in the corners of every room. Over time, these experiences shaped the customs surrounding childbirth. In some places, communities gathered before a birth to offer blessings and help prepare the lying-in chamber. In others, families maintained a discreet distance, unwilling to tempt fate by presuming a safe delivery. In every case, childbirth remained an event both intimate and communal, a moment when the vulnerabilities of the body met the mysteries of life itself. It is easy now to imagine that such stories belong to some distant, primitive past. But the truth is, even well into the 19th century, medical knowledge was limited, and these agonizing decisions remained part of the experience of childbirth. Early surgical interventions like cesarean sections were rarely performed and almost always fatal for the mother. Only in the late 1800s and early 1900s did antiseptics, anesthesia, and improved understanding of anatomy begin to shift the balance. Still, generations had already passed through rooms like the one you pictured. Rooms where a woman labored through long nights, surrounded by watchful faces and the weight of decisions no one should ever have to make. Their resilience was often quiet, almost invisible, but it shaped families and communities in profound ways. When you imagine these scenes, you might feel a quiet respect for the midwives who bore this responsibility with as much grace as they could. Their hands learned the feel of a living baby, the tremor of a failing heartbeat, the subtle changes in a woman's breathing. Their judgment was sometimes the only thing standing between life and loss. Even when they could do nothing more, they remained, offering comfort in a time when certainty was rare. This was the rhythm of their lives, a constant struggle to protect what was most precious, a struggle often carried out in silence. The history of childbirth is not only a story of suffering, it is also a story of courage, of communities adapting to impossible circumstances, and of women whose strength left quiet legacies that still echo in our own time. As you allow your mind to drift, you can picture those candlelit rooms, the hushed voices, the patient hands. In that space, the choice between mother and child was a burden no one wanted, yet one that countless women and midwives bore with as much tenderness as their world allowed. No knowledge of germs meant babies died from dirty hands. Imagine yourself standing in a medieval cottage, the kind with low beams darkened by smoke and walls packed with wattle and daub. In the corner, a woman rests after childbirth, her breathing shallow but steady. A baby lies swaddled at her side, small and silent. The air smells of damp rushes and old wood. No one in the room has washed their hands. No one believes they need to. In those centuries, the idea that invisible things could carry death was beyond even the most learned physicians. The world was understood through what could be seen, smelled, or felt. If a wound grew red and oozed, people might say it was bad humors or corruption in the blood. If a baby sickened, it was attributed to bad air or the will of God. No one spoke of bacteria. No one could imagine an entire realm of tiny life moving unseen across skin and cloth, from person to person. Caregivers who tended newborns often worked by lamplight, wiping their hands on aprons soiled with the remains of previous births. The same linens were folded, stored, and brought out again when the next labor began. In many households, water was precious, saved for drinking or cooking. A midwife might rinse her hands quickly, but thorough washing with soap and clean water was rare. To those present, it simply wasn't necessary. The tools used during childbirth were simple: a knife to cut the cord, a cloth to clean the infant, a band to tie the cord in place. These objects might be wiped or shaken out, but they were not boiled or scalded. Metal could rust if left wet too long. Linen was expensive to replace. And besides, no one suspected that these ordinary items could harbor lethal agents. If you picture yourself in that room, you might see a midwife lifting the baby, examining tiny limbs for signs of strength. Perhaps the baby coughs, a wet, rattling sound, and everyone exchanges worried glances. They will try herbal infusions, warm compresses, whispered prayers. But whatever is already in the child's body will not be stopped by these gestures. Some records describe how entire families would lose infants within days of one another. A mother might deliver twins or triplets, only to watch helplessly as they developed fevers and slipped away. This sorrow was not unusual. It was a recurring pattern, an accepted part of life's fragile beginnings. In wealthier households, physicians might be called. These learned men wore long gowns and carried tools of their trade. They brought knowledge of ancient texts, theories about the four humors and the influence of the stars. Yet even in these more privileged settings, the basic cause of infection remained a mystery. The same physician who examined a laboring mother might go directly to another patient without cleaning his hands or tools. His confidence was undiminished. In some regions, caregivers believed that stale air, or miasma, caused illness. Windows would be opened to let in drafts, or bundles of fragrant herbs hung in corners to purify the room. These practices, though ineffective against bacteria, did reflect an intuitive sense that environment shaped health. but they could not prevent the spread of infection from hand to hand, cloth to skin. Imagine, now, a mother reaching out to comfort her newborn. Her hands are strong from work in the fields, her nails edged with earth. She does not know that what clings beneath them could enter her baby's bloodstream through the navel or a tiny scratch. The knowledge that would one day save countless lives simply does not exist. When babies died, families looked for reasons in the visible world or in the moral one. Perhaps the mother had worked too hard during pregnancy. Perhaps a curse had been laid. Perhaps the child was too frail, and nothing could be done. These explanations were easier to accept than the idea that a clean cloth or a basin of soapy water might have changed the outcome. Over time, midwives developed careful routines that did help in small ways, changing linens more often, burning soiled bandages, airing out rooms. Yet these improvements were fragmentary and inconsistent, handed down by word of mouth rather than scientific understanding. The vast majority of babies were still born into environments where invisible dangers waited on every surface. Even centuries later, when microscopes first revealed the existence of tiny creatures in a drop of water, many physicians refused to believe these were the cause of disease. The idea seemed too fantastic. Only in the 19th century did germ theory take hold, slowly transforming childbirth from a gamble to a safer process. It is worth imagining how radical it must have felt to be told that your own hands could carry death, that an unseen world existed in the folds of your apron or the blade of your knife. For countless generations, such an idea would have sounded absurd, even offensive. It was easier to blame fate. Yet within those darkened cottages, where babies were born and died in equal measure, you can still glimpse the unchanging humanity that connects us to them. The love that made parents grieve, the hope that each new child might live longer, and the quiet determination to carry on even when hope was often betrayed. So, as you let your mind drift, imagine the tender ordinariness of those moments. A mother whispering lullabies, a midwife adjusting a blanket, a father peering anxiously into the cradle. The gestures are familiar, the emotions unchanged across centuries. Only the knowledge was missing, knowledge that would have transformed those simple acts of care into true protection. Today, we rarely think of washing our hands before touching a baby as an extraordinary act. Yet it is precisely this understanding, the simple power of clean hands, that once stood between countless children and their first chance at life. Let that thought settle around you gently, like the hush that fell over medieval rooms in the hours after birth. A hush filled with equal measures of hope and unspoken fear. And in that quiet, remember that the world we inherit has been shaped not only by progress, but by the long shadows of what we did not know. With each dawn that came to those families, there was the same longing, that this child, unlike so many before, might wake to see another sunrise. Winter births were a death sentence without firewood. Imagine yourself standing inside a small, timber-framed cottage, its roof thatched with straw and rimed with frost. The dawn light creeps in through the chinks in the walls, but it brings no warmth. Instead, the cold seems to deepen with every hour, settling into the stones of the hearth and the rough-woven blankets that try, without much success, to keep out the winter air. In much of Europe before modern heating, winter was a season of constant calculation: how to make the firewood last, how to stretch a dwindling pile of peat, whether to spend precious hours gathering branches too damp to burn cleanly. For women who gave birth in these months, survival was often as fragile as the embers that glowed in the hearth. A single night without a fire could change everything. The arrival of a child in winter should have been an occasion of relief after months of pregnancy and the uncertainty of labor. But when the air turned bitter and the wind pressed through every crack, a newborn's first breaths were a peril instead of a promise. In the first weeks of life, a baby cannot regulate its body temperature. Without warmth, their small limbs would stiffen, their breathing would slow, and they could slip away in the darkness without a sound. Imagine a young mother, exhausted from childbirth, sitting beside a hearth that has burned down to a scattering of gray ash. She wraps her infant in layers of cloth and holds it close to her breast, feeling the chill on her own skin as the cold seeps through her skirts. There is no more firewood. Perhaps a neighbor has a stack of logs, but even asking for help carries the burden of obligation. Wood was currency in these months, something to be measured, traded, and guarded carefully. In the northern countryside, people sometimes brought livestock indoors to share what little heat the animals could offer. The body heat of a cow or donkey could lift the temperature enough to keep a newborn alive. The air in these dwellings grew heavy with the scents of hay, manure, and damp wool, but the warmth was worth every discomfort. A small, thatched byre attached to the house became a sanctuary of borrowed heat. In wealthier households, the risk was lower. A better stocked woodpile, thicker walls, and more servants meant fires could burn day and night. But for peasants, for tenants living on the edge of subsistence, each log laid on the fire was a decision. Burn it now, or keep it for tomorrow. The long nights of January could stretch into weeks of privation. It was not uncommon for parents to take shifts staying awake beside the cradle, adding scraps of kindling or simply breathing warm air over a baby's face. If you picture the interior of such a home, you might notice how every object had a role in holding the cold at bay. The rushes on the floor insulated against icy drafts. Bundles of old cloth were stuffed between the rafters and the walls. Clay pots heated on the fire were sometimes wrapped and placed in the bedding like primitive hot water bottles. Even so, many families found these efforts were not enough. When a child died of cold, there was little ceremony. The cause was understood, there was simply no fuel to spare. Parish registers record these losses in the same plain language they used for all infant deaths. Died in winter, no fire. These words conceal the quiet grief that filled the small rooms, the way mothers and fathers would hold the tiny body a little longer before carrying it out into the snow. In some regions, communal efforts offered relief. Village wood commons could be accessed by those most in need, and neighbors sometimes banded together to help a mother who had just given birth. It was a kindness born of recognition. Everyone understood that in the coldest weeks, no family was truly safe. A single illness, a single storm, could strip away the margin of survival. Imagine the rhythm of their lives, the cautious rationing of resources, the quiet prayers murmured beside a dwindling flame, the watchful nights when sleep could not be risked. In these homes, each sunrise was a small triumph. If the child stirred and cried for milk, there was a flicker of hope. If the stillness held, there was only the long walk to the churchyard. Over generations, customs evolved to protect newborns as best they could. In some areas, the mother and baby did not leave the warmest part of the house for 40 days, a tradition that mingled practical necessity with spiritual significance. Midwives taught simple techniques: warming cloths in the oven, wrapping infants in lamb's wool, tucking hot stones near the bedding. Even these measures, however, were no guarantee. Winter births remained perilous well into the modern era. Only with coal stoves, improved chimneys, and better insulation did the threat of freezing begin to recede. Yet the memory of those losses lingered. In folk songs and family stories, the image of the child who did not wake was woven into the collective consciousness. Today, when you walk into a warm, brightly lit nursery, it is almost impossible to imagine that warmth itself was once a privilege rather than a certainty. But in centuries past, the struggle to keep a baby alive through winter was as real and as constant as hunger or disease. As you let your thoughts drift across time, picture that small cottage once more. The dim light, the muffled sounds of livestock shifting in their stalls, the hush of snow falling on the roof. In that world, the difference between life and death could be measured in a single armful of firewood. And in the quiet hours before dawn, every parent held their child a little closer, hoping that the embers would last until morning. Parents slept with infants to keep them warm and crushed them. Imagine yourself in a small, timber-framed cottage. The hearth glows faintly in the darkness, the embers no longer bright enough to fill the room with more than a dull orange haze. The walls are thick with the scent of damp earth, smoke, and the woolen blankets that have absorbed generations of life. In this narrow space, entire families gathered each night, seeking warmth wherever they could find it. This was the world of co-sleeping, a practice born of necessity rather than preference. In places where winter frost crept through the chinks in the walls and even summer nights turned cold, it was unthinkable to lay a baby in a cradle apart from the body heat that meant survival. Beds were often no more than a low wooden platform or a mattress stuffed with straw, shared by parents, children, and sometimes even grandparents. Under rough linen sheets and patched quilts, bodies pressed close together until dawn. The rhythm of these nights was shaped by fatigue. By day, adults labored in fields, kitchens, or workshops. They carried water, ground grain, tended animals. When evening came, they were spent in body and mind. Imagine the sensation of slipping into that shared bed, bone-tired, eyelids heavy, muscles aching from work that offered little rest. In the hush that followed the day's exertion, they drew infants against their chests, trusting that their own warmth and breathing would keep the smallest family members alive. Yet the very closeness that preserved life also held danger. Historical records and coroners' rolls occasionally note a tragedy that was both common and devastating. Babies were found lifeless in the morning, their tiny faces pressed into the bedding or their parents' arms. These moments were met with a quiet resignation. Inquest juries sometimes recorded the cause in simple, unembellished language, overlaid by the mother, or smothered in sleep. No one needed further explanation. It was an ever-present risk, a sorrow that hovered just beyond the edge of every night. To understand this practice, you must first imagine the scarcity that shaped it. Few households could afford the luxury of separate rooms, let alone a dedicated nursery. Cradles, when they existed, were often simple wooden boxes pulled close to the bed. In colder months, even a cradle could not protect a baby from the chill that settled over the floorboards. And so the choice was stark: keep the infant beside you or watch it succumb to cold. Some parents devised ways to lessen the danger. In certain regions, boards known as bed guards were placed between the adults and the child. In wealthier homes, a small, divided sleeping space might be built into the main bed frame, an early attempt to balance warmth and safety. But these measures were not always possible. For the majority of families, survival meant embracing the paradox of shared sleep, the comfort of togetherness and the threat of unintentional harm. Picture a winter evening as the family settles in. The fire burns low, throwing shadows up the plastered wall. The baby, swaddled in layers of cloth, lies nestled against the mother's side. Perhaps she is singing a lullaby in a voice almost too quiet to hear, her words trailing off as exhaustion overtakes her. Outside, the wind scratches at the shutters, but inside, the breathing of several people merges into a steady rhythm. In this suspended time, the line between life and loss is perilously thin. When a death did occur, grief was compounded by guilt. Parish records often reveal a tone of gentle admonition from clerics and coroners, an acknowledgement of sorrow tempered with the understanding that poverty and necessity left families with few options. There was little recourse to judgment or blame. Communities knew that any household could wake to the same heartbreak. In cities and towns, the problem was so widespread that church authorities occasionally issued edicts warning against co-sleeping. These notices were posted on church doors or read aloud during services, their language at once compassionate and severe. Some regions levied fines or required penance. But despite the warnings, few families could comply. The same conditions, cold nights, shared spaces, relentless fatigue, continued generation after generation. Over time, patterns emerged in the language of official documents. Terms like overlaying became part of the legal vocabulary, a kind of shorthand for a sorrow too common to require further explanation. The phrase appears again and again, each time referring to a life that began and ended between the same coarse sheets. Imagine the morning after such a night. The fire rekindled, a pot of thin porridge warming over the flame. The hush in the cottage deeper than usual. A father steps outside to draw water, avoiding the eyes of neighbors who have heard. The mother sits on the edge of the bed, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on a spot in the straw where the light falls. There are no words, only the knowledge that life will go on, though a part of it has slipped away. Gradually, the rise of better heating, improvements in household construction, and evolving ideas about child-rearing began to change these patterns. By the 19th century, wealthier families increasingly embraced separate sleeping arrangements. Publications on childcare began to recommend cribs or sidecar beds. But for the poor, the shift came slowly. Even into the 20th century, Co-sleeping remained a fact of life in many rural and working-class households. Yet for all its risks, shared sleep was also a testament to resilience. Parents did what they could with what they had. They swaddled infants against their hearts because there was nowhere else warm enough to lay them. They took the chance, night after night, that their own weariness would not betray them. As you picture those long-ago nights, allow yourself to linger on the quieter details. The crackle of a fire barely alive, the steady cadence of breathing in the dark, the weight of a tiny body curled beneath a rough woolen blanket. In these moments, you glimpse a way of life shaped by necessity rather than preference. A way of life where love and risk were inextricably bound together, and where every dawn brought the hope that this night, at least, had passed without sorrow. And so, when you think of the past, remember that the story of overlaying is not only one of loss. It is also a story of endurance, of families holding their children close in the only way they could, and of the quiet courage it took to face each night's uncertainty with the simple, unspoken hope that the morning would come gently. Daughters meant dowries families couldn't afford. Imagine yourself in a modest hall warmed by the glow of a single hearth. The air is heavy with the mingled scents of drying herbs, woolen garments, and the faint sweetness of bread stored in a wooden chest. In this house, a mother sits quietly by the fire, her thoughts fixed not only on the infant cradled in her arms, but on the burdens her birth will bring. For much of medieval Europe, a daughter was both a blessing and a problem. A girl could become a valued link in the web of kinship ties, her marriage forging alliances that strengthened a family's standing. But to reach that point required a dowry, a substantial offering of land, coin, household goods, or livestock. Without it, no reputable marriage could be arranged, no future secured. The rhythm of their lives was measured not only in harvests and seasons, but in the slow, mounting pressure to set aside enough wealth to make a daughter desirable to another household. For poorer families, the task was daunting. A farmer might own little beyond the land he worked, his savings swallowed by taxes, tithes, and the daily cost of survival. Each additional child further strained his resources. When a girl was born, the quiet joy was often edged by dread. How will we afford her dowry when the time comes? In wealthier households, the stakes were different but no less exacting. Among the gentry or merchant classes, dowries served not only as a practical contribution to the new household but as a symbol of status. A modest offering might condemn a daughter to a lesser match. A lavish dowry could elevate the family's standing and bring profitable alliances. Fathers spent years negotiating the best possible arrangements, weighing each proposal against the family's dwindling coffers. Imagine the careful work of assembling a dowry. A mother might set aside fine linens, spinning and embroidering each piece in long winter evenings. A father might reserve the proceeds of a particular harvest or the sale of livestock. Gold coins were hidden in carved boxes, counted and recounted with anxious care. Every small illness, every bad season, threatened to undo years of preparation. When the time came to marry a daughter, the process was formal and often intimidating. Negotiations could stretch on for months, conducted in hushed conversations around a heavy table. A girl's worth was measured in precise terms: so many marks of silver, so many acres of land, so many bolts of cloth. These calculations were not hidden from the young women themselves. From an early age, they understood that their future rested on sums their parents could scarcely afford. For families too poor or too burdened to gather an acceptable dowry, another path often presented itself. A daughter might be sent to a convent. In theory, the religious life was a calling, a noble sacrifice in service to God. In practice, it was sometimes a practical escape from financial ruin. The entry fee to a convent was often less costly than a dowry, and a girl who took the veil was removed from the marriage market. While this decision might bring relief to struggling parents, it could leave a daughter with little say in the course of her life. Imagine the quiet departure of a girl bound for the convent. Her family might gather to watch her go, a small procession along the village road. Some wept openly, others maintained a careful composure. For many, it was an ending as much as a beginning, a severing of ties to ordinary life. Within the convent walls, she would exchange her family's ambitions for the steady rhythms of prayer, work, and reflection. For those who remained at home, the pressure never truly disappeared. Even after a daughter's marriage, there were obligations to fulfill, gifts to send, debts to repay, expectations to meet. If the family's fortunes changed for the worse, they could find themselves unable to meet these promises. Disgrace and legal disputes might follow, leaving reputations in tatters. Among the nobility, the stakes were higher still. A daughter's dowry might include entire estates, castles, or lucrative rights to tolls and markets. In these circles, the politics of marriage were inescapable. A young noblewoman could be engaged in childhood to a man she would not meet for years. Her dowry would be pledged, her life mapped out before she could form her own desires. The grandeur of such arrangements did little to soften the underlying reality. She was part of a transaction as much as an individual. The rhythm of their lives was shaped by this relentless arithmetic. Every child born carried a hidden ledger of debts and expectations. Every meal shared around the hearth was shaded by the knowledge that someday, the family would be called upon to pay a price simply for the privilege of raising a daughter. Yet even within these constraints, families found ways to love and honor their girls. Mothers taught them the skills that would make them valued wives: spinning, weaving, the keeping of accounts, the delicate art of managing a household's reputation. Fathers, though burdened by worry, might still find moments to laugh and tell stories, to reassure a daughter that she was cherished even as she was counted. Imagine a quiet evening, the fire burning low, as a girl stitches a fine hem by candlelight. Her mother sits nearby, hands busy with her own mending, offering small corrections and gentle praise. In that moment, the weight of dowries and obligations recedes, replaced by the simple comfort of shared work and patient instruction. When the time came to part, whether for marriage or the convent, families often marked the transition with ceremony and prayer. Neighbors might gather to witness the departure, to offer gifts or blessings. A girl stepping into her new life carried with her not only the goods her family had scraped together, but also the quiet hopes that she would be safe, respected, and perhaps even happy. And so the pattern repeated across generations. Daughters born into a world that valued them in precise sums, measured in silver and land, yet still loved them in ways that defied such calculations. The rhythm of their lives was a constant negotiation between affection and obligation, between pride and fear, between the promise of the future and the cost of reaching it. Even now, in the quiet hush before dawn, you can almost hear the measured breathing of families long vanished, their hopes and worries woven into the fabric of history like the fine linens they labored to provide. Pregnant women were blamed for misfortunes. Imagine yourself in a small, close-knit village, the kind where every window held a watching eye and every doorway whispered stories. In such a place, people searched constantly for explanations. If the rain fell too heavily or not at all, if the crops yellowed in the fields, or if lightning struck the tallest tree, someone would be blamed. For much of history, pregnant women were among the first to fall under suspicion. In many societies, pregnancy was seen not just as a natural event but as a mysterious state that blurred the boundaries between life and unseen forces. A woman carrying new life was thought to attract energies, sometimes good, sometimes dangerously disruptive. When milk soured in the churn, when illness crept through a herd of animals, or when an unexpected frost killed the wheat, neighbors might murmur that a pregnant woman's presence had disturbed the balance. These suspicions were not always vague, harmless folklore. They could quickly become accusations that changed the course of a woman's life. Imagine a mother-to-be who already felt the strain of carrying her child, her body heavy, her nights restless, now facing the quiet hostility of her own community. A glance that lingered too long, a door closed just a little too firmly, a conversation that stopped as she passed. Each moment built a sense of isolation that was difficult to escape. When misfortune struck, it was common for people to search for signs that a woman had unknowingly invited harm. Perhaps she had walked alone at dusk, when spirits were believed to be strongest. Perhaps she had neglected a small ritual, tying a protective charm around her wrist, leaving an offering at a sacred tree, or reciting a customary blessing. Even a moment of anger or sorrow could be seen as evidence that she had attracted dangerous forces. In some regions, women wore amulets to ward off these suspicions. Small bags of herbs, bits of iron, or carved figures were hidden in their clothing. These tokens were meant not only to protect the unborn child but to reassure neighbors that the woman herself did not harbor ill will. Still, if lightning struck a house or if a healthy child fell ill, no amulet could entirely erase suspicion. Imagine the quiet dread of waking to find the milk had spoiled overnight, thickened and sour in the pail. A husband's uneasy glance. A neighbor's careful questions. Soon, the story would ripple outward, growing in certainty each time it was retold. Before long, it might be spoken as fact. Her pregnancy had drawn in some malevolent force, or her secret bitterness had turned to poison. For many pregnant women, this fear of blame shaped their daily lives. They avoided the edges of fields where spirits were thought to linger. They did not linger near the village well, where gossip spread as swiftly as water. Even simple kindnesses, helping deliver a neighbor's calf, nursing a sick child, could later be twisted into evidence of meddling when things went wrong. In some places, authorities or local elders held informal hearings when suspicions grew too strong to ignore. A woman might be summoned to account for herself, standing in a cold hall or under the spreading branches of a village tree. There, she would answer questions about her habits, her thoughts, her dreams, details ordinary and extraordinary, all sifted for signs of hidden malice. Imagine the strain of such questioning while still carrying the weight of pregnancy, knowing that any slip of the tongue could be seized upon as proof. Punishments varied. Sometimes, it was a formal censure, being forbidden from gathering water at the main well, or barred from entering certain homes. In harsher communities, women were publicly shamed, forced to stand on the threshold of the church while their neighbors filed past in silent reproach. A few were driven out altogether, left to find shelter in distant hamlets or to survive in the woods until their children were born. Yet even amid these suspicions, there were gestures of quiet solidarity. Other women, themselves mothers or grandmothers, sometimes offered comfort. A bowl of broth left on a doorstep, a whispered blessing in passing. These small kindnesses did not erase the fear, but they reminded the accused that not every heart was turned against them. The roots of these beliefs stretched back centuries, woven from old pagan ideas and later folded into religious teachings. In many cultures, any event that defied easy explanation was quickly attributed to the influence of unseen forces. A pregnant woman's body, so visibly transformed, became an easy symbol for that uncertainty. Her swelling belly seemed to mark her as both miraculous and potentially dangerous, the bearer of life and the possible herald of doom. Over time, as understanding of disease and weather slowly improved, these old fears began to lose their power. Lightning came to be seen as a natural phenomenon rather than a punishment. Spoiled milk was understood as the result of bacteria, not curses. But for generations of women, those explanations arrived too late to ease the burden of suspicion. Imagine the quiet relief when a child was safely born, when the season's harvest proved abundant despite every omen. In those moments, blame would fade back into the background, unspoken but never entirely forgotten. The woman who had been shunned might be welcomed back with cautious goodwill, her presence no longer a source of dread. This was the rhythm of their lives, a constant negotiation between belief and necessity, between fear and the everyday labors that bound communities together. Though their names rarely appear in written records, the pregnant women who endured suspicion and isolation shaped the resilience of their villages in ways no one fully recorded. As you drift into thought, you can picture those small, smoke-darkened rooms, the hush of voices around the fire, the quiet strength it took to keep going. Even in the face of blame and fear, many women carried on, tending their families, preparing for birth, and meeting each day with a steady endurance. Their stories remind us that suspicion can be as heavy a burden as any physical hardship, and that simple understanding can be the most powerful protection of all. Babies were swaddled so tightly they couldn't move. Imagine yourself in a small medieval cottage. The walls are pale plaster streaked with soot. The rafters smell of old timber and drying herbs. In one corner, a wooden cradle stands near the hearth. Inside, a baby lies motionless, wrapped so completely in linen strips that only the round face is visible. The eyes blink slowly, the mouth opens in a soft sigh, but the tiny limbs cannot move at all. For centuries, swaddling was considered one of the most essential practices of caring for a newborn. In a world without modern medicine, people believed that a baby's soft bones and pliable joints were especially vulnerable. If left to flail and kick, it was thought the child would grow crooked or misshapen. To prevent this, swaddling became a universal custom across Europe and beyond. New mothers, midwives, or elder women of the household would begin by laying out long bands of linen. Some of these strips were coarse and unbleached. Others were soft, saved especially for infants. The baby would be laid on a folded square of cloth, often called a swaddling square, which protected the skin from rougher layers. Then, methodically and firmly, the wrapping began. The legs were straightened, the arms pressed close to the sides. Linen strips were wound over and over, around the torso, across the hips, down to the ankles. Each layer was tugged snug to keep the baby's body in what was believed to be the correct shape, long and straight, without any bends or sags. When you picture this, it helps to remember that it wasn't seen as cruelty. To medieval minds, this was an act of protection, a safeguard against a lifetime of deformity or weakness. Babies were born, as people then believed, imperfect, and it was the duty of the family to mold them into sturdy, well-formed adults. In many households, once the wrapping was complete, the baby was tied into the cradle or secured to a board. A padded cap might be tied under the chin to keep the head warm. In winter, heavier layers were added against the cold. If you had visited such a home, you might have seen rows of swaddled infants lined up near the hearth, as silent and still as dolls. Yet these practices could be harsh. A baby swaddled too tightly might struggle to expand its chest. Some infants gasped for air or turned dusky with lack of oxygen. Still, parents and nurses often interpreted these signs differently. A silent baby was thought to be content, calmed by the gentle compression. Few imagined that the child was unable to cry for help. Swaddling also had practical purposes. A baby immobilized in this way was easier to carry and could be left safely in a cradle while adults worked in the fields or tended the household. A mother might check the bindings only a few times a day, changing the swaddling when it became soiled. Some infants remained wrapped almost continuously for weeks. Across cultures, variations on swaddling appeared. In parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, babies were bound to flat boards called cradle boards. The child was laid flat, wrapped securely, and strapped to the wooden frame. This allowed mothers to wear the baby on the back or prop it upright while they worked. In some traditions, the practice persisted into toddlerhood. Imagine the small sounds in a medieval cottage, the crackle of the hearth, the creak of wood as someone shifts their weight. From the cradle comes only a faint sigh. To the people of the time, this stillness was a sign that the baby was safe and properly cared for. Movement was seen not as a healthy impulse but as a risk of harm. Occasionally, voices of concern appeared in old records. A midwife here or a learned physician there might warn that too tight binding could damage the chest or hips. But without understanding circulation, muscle development, or respiration, few could fully grasp the dangers. Most simply believed they were doing what had always been done. It was not until the 17th and 18th centuries that opinions began to shift more widely. Medical writers started to suggest that babies left unwrapped were healthier and stronger. They observed that infants who were allowed to move their limbs seemed to grow more robust. Still, in many communities, the habit of swaddling persisted well into the 19th century. Picture a mother unwrapping her child at last. The linen bands fall away one by one, revealing a small body pale from lack of sunlight, limbs slow to unfold. This scene was not a moment of alarm but a familiar ritual. The baby might be washed, briefly stretched, and then wrapped again, tight and straight. The practice also influenced how babies were fed and soothed. Because they could not use their hands to grasp or reach, infants relied entirely on adults to bring comfort. A swaddled baby could not roll over, could not escape discomfort, could not pull away from heat or insects. The world was something that simply happened around them. If you allow your imagination to drift further, you can see how swaddling reflected the broader mindset of the time, the conviction that nature must be controlled, shaped, and restrained. From agriculture to architecture to child rearing, The impulse was to bind the world into order. Babies, like fields or flocks, were shaped to suit the expectations of their elders. Today, we have learned that freedom of movement helps develop strong muscles and coordination. We know that babies are born with reflexes designed to train their bodies to reach, grasp, and explore. Modern swaddling, when it is used at all, is softer, looser, and far more temporary. Yet in those earlier centuries, the sight of a firmly wrapped infant inspired reassurance, not fear. As you let your thoughts settle, imagine the quiet patience of those long-ago parents, wrapping their children with hands calloused from work, convinced that this was the first act of love and duty. Imagine the hush that fell over the room as the final knot was tied. A hush filled with hope, caution, and an unspoken belief that a child could be protected if only they were bound tightly enough. And in that stillness, centuries passed, countless babies swaddled, countless mothers watching, countless dawns rising over cradles where no movement disturbed the covers. Only later did the world learn that life's beginnings could be gentler and that freedom, not binding, was the safest cradle of all. Poor families reused cloth diapers infested with vermin. Imagine yourself standing at the threshold of a small, timbered cottage. The door hangs slightly ajar, and the faintest breeze carries out the mingled scents of wood smoke, damp straw, and something less pleasant. A sour, lingering odor born of the daily struggle to keep clean what could never be truly clean. In this world, before running water or antiseptic soap, the simplest tasks were complex negotiations with dirt, insects, and scarcity. Among these challenges, the care of infants occupied a particularly fraught corner of daily life. A newborn required constant tending, feeding, swaddling, rocking, and above all, cleaning. But for poor families whose days were already filled with labor, the idea of washing cloth diapers after every use was often impossible. Water had to be hauled from a well or stream, sometimes half a mile away. Firewood to heat it was rationed with the same care as flour or salt. Soap, when it could be had at all, was precious enough to be saved for only the dirtiest linens or rare baths. And so, the practice emerged that many today would find unthinkable. Diapers were set aside to dry without thorough washing. A mother might take a soiled cloth out to the thin winter sunlight, shake it, and drape it over a fence post or bush to air. The breeze and the hours would leach away some of the odor, but the cloth retained far more than a trace of its last use. When it was time to wrap the baby again, the same fabric would be folded and tied in place, still bearing the residue of countless changings. The rhythm of their lives required this compromise. To clean everything properly would have consumed every daylight hour. A mother who spent her mornings boiling diapers over the fire could not grind grain, mend clothes, or tend to the garden. Even when the will existed, the resources often did not. Water itself could be too scarce or too cold to haul in sufficient quantity, especially in winter. In these folds of reused linen, lice and fleas found an ideal refuge. They clung to seams and edges, hiding in creases until warmth and skin returned. Once established, they were all but impossible to eradicate without prolonged washing in scalding water and hours in the sun. Most families could not afford the fuel to heat cauldrons large enough for all their bedding and baby clothes. And so the insects persisted, moving from diaper to cradle to hair, a quiet, unremarkable presence in daily life. Imagine a woman crouched by the hearth, shaking out a small cloth in the dim light. She might pause to pick away a speck or two, but she knows that she cannot spare the wood to heat more water today. Instead, she arranges the cloth with care, folding it into neat layers, trying to believe that the breeze has done enough. The baby fusses nearby, red-cheeked and restless. She lifts the child and settles it in her arms, murmuring soft words as she wraps the cloth in place. This was not negligence. It was a reality dictated by poverty, by the weight of too many tasks and too few hours. Neighbors might have done the same. In the poorest quarters of towns and villages, most households lived in a similar state of quiet endurance. Even when a family possessed more cloth, keeping it clean was a constant struggle. Without soap, without plentiful water, and without time, dirt was an inevitable companion. Disease, too, made its home in these circumstances. Fleas could carry typhus. Lice spread fevers that sometimes passed unnoticed until several members of a household fell ill. Rashes and sores were common on infants' delicate skin, and some children developed infections that proved fatal. Yet these dangers were so familiar that they scarcely merited comment in parish records. A child might die of weakness or fever, vague words that encompassed everything from malnutrition to sepsis. Even in wealthier homes, perfect cleanliness was difficult to achieve. Though they might have more linens and better access to heated water, they still relied on laborious manual washing. A laundress might boil and scrub diapers in great copper pots, scouring them with lye soap and laying them across hedges to bleach in the sun. But for those without servants, without spare cloth, without fuel, the same process was an unaffordable luxury. Imagine the soft sounds of the cottage at dusk, the low crackle of the hearth, the faint sigh of wind through thatched eaves, the rustle of straw mattresses settling as a family prepares for another night. The mother smooths the last of the dried diapers into a pile, feeling the roughness where repeated use has worn the weave thin. She glances at the baby, who sleeps curled in a wooden cradle stuffed with rags. She knows that tomorrow she will repeat this ritual, shake, hang, fold, and reuse. It is all she can do. Over time, as towns grew larger and trade expanded, soap became more available, and public wash houses offered communal facilities. But this change was slow, uneven, and rarely reached the rural poor. In some places, the practice of reusing unwashed cloth diapers lingered well into the 19th century. Even when a mother could finally afford better, the memory of those lean years never left her. When you consider the small, persistent hardships of the past, it is easy to overlook them in favor of grander narratives, wars, monarchs, discoveries. Yet here, in the daily repetition of drying and reusing soiled cloth, you see the quiet truth of history. Survival often rested on the simplest, most unglamorous decisions. A choice between boiling water or saving fuel, between washing cloth or baking bread. As you drift toward rest or reflection, picture the worn hands of generations of mothers, lifting the same linen again and again, hoping each time that it would be enough to keep their children safe. The rhythm of their lives was a constant balancing act, between cleanliness and hunger, between warmth and exhaustion, between the fear of sickness and the need to simply keep going. And in the folds of those modest cloths, the resilience of entire families was stitched, thread by thread, into the fabric of their days. Priests controlled whether a child could be buried. Imagine yourself in a small, quiet churchyard. The early morning mist hangs low over the uneven rows of gravestones, each one marked with a simple cross or a carved symbol of faith. The air smells of damp grass and old stone, and the hush is broken only by the caw of a distant crow. In this solemn place, families gathered generation after generation to lay their loved ones to rest. But not every life was permitted the same dignity in death. In the world of medieval and early modern Europe, spiritual authority shaped nearly every aspect of life and death. The parish priest was more than a religious figure. He was the gatekeeper to rites that offered comfort to the living and salvation to the departed. Among the most delicate and heartbreaking of these decisions was whether a child could be buried in consecrated ground. To understand this, imagine the fragile reality of infancy in those centuries. Many babies did not survive their first days. Illness, poor nutrition, and the hazards of birth took a heavy toll. In some households, a newborn's first cries were met with both joy and quiet dread. Parents knew the days ahead were uncertain. Baptism was believed to be essential, an urgent safeguard against the stain of original sin. It was not merely a ceremony of welcome but a spiritual rescue. Even hours of delay could seem perilous. Picture a midwife hurrying through muddy lanes to summon a priest, her skirts gathered in one hand, her breath visible in the cold air. Inside the house, a mother clings to consciousness as her child is held near, waiting for holy water to be sprinkled over a fragile forehead. Sometimes the priest arrived too late. In the official doctrine of the time, an unbaptized baby's soul hovered in uncertainty. The church taught that such souls could not enter heaven. Instead, they would remain in limbo, neither punished nor redeemed, but forever apart. For grieving families, this idea brought an added weight to their sorrow. When a baby died unbaptized, the question of burial became painfully complex. Consecrated ground was reserved for those who had been ritually cleansed. Parish priests were charged with defending the sanctity of the cemetery. For some, compassion guided their decisions, and they quietly allowed burial within the churchyard. Others, bound by stricter interpretations or fear of ecclesiastical censure, refused. Imagine the moment when a family, wrapped in grief, carried a tiny bundle to the church door, only to be turned away. The priest might step forward in his dark robes, his face composed but unyielding. His words would be calm, even gentle, yet final. The child could not rest among the faithful. The mother, already hollowed by loss, would be left to carry her child back down the lane, past the curious eyes of neighbors. Some communities created separate plots beyond the churchyard walls. These unofficial burial grounds were often little more than a corner of a field or a small clearing at the edge of the village. The soil there was unconsecrated, its status a visible sign of exclusion. To bury a child in such a place was to acknowledge, however reluctantly, that the ordinary comfort of a church burial was withheld. Over time, practices varied. In some regions, local customs softened the severity of doctrine. Midwives were granted the authority to perform emergency baptisms, using any clean water at hand. A few priests, moved by compassion or pressed by desperate families, agreed to bless the graves afterward. But even these acts did not fully erase the sense of shame. To have a child buried outside consecrated ground was to carry a quiet mark, one that neighbors remembered long after the grave itself had sunk into the earth. Picture a winter evening, the light fading over a small homestead. A woman sits by the hearth, mending a child's garment, her face lined with weariness. Somewhere nearby lies a grave she cannot visit without remembering the day she was told no. The shame was not always spoken aloud, but it lived on, in whispered stories, in glances that turned away, in the lingering sense that some part of her loss was her own failing. In the centuries that followed, theological debates arose about the fate of unbaptized infants. Philosophers and clergy wrestled with questions of mercy and justice. Some argued that an all-compassionate God could not condemn a soul for circumstances beyond its control. Others clung to older teachings, fearing that any relaxation of doctrine would undermine the Church's authority. Gradually, official attitudes softened. Enlightenment thinking encouraged a gentler understanding of childhood and spiritual innocence. By the modern era, many denominations formally abandoned the idea that unbaptized babies were barred from sacred burial grounds. But the change came slowly, and for countless families across generations, it arrived too late to ease their grief. Imagine yourself standing in that old churchyard again, the grass cool beneath your feet, the headstones leaning at uncertain angles. Somewhere beyond the low wall, in an unmarked plot, a child once laid to rest without rites waits in the collective memory. No plaque records the name. No cross marks the spot. Yet the love that carried the tiny body to that place, and the quiet resilience that endured afterward, are part of the same human story, one shaped as much by sorrow as by faith. And so, when you consider the past, allow yourself to linger on these quieter histories. The morning a mother rose before dawn to prepare a child's burial gown. The midday walk down the village lane, past the chapel she could not enter. The evening when the family gathered in silence around the hearth, knowing that some griefs could never fully be shared. These moments, hushed and enduring, remind us that history is not only shaped by the doctrines of powerful institutions but by the tender, unseen courage of ordinary people who carried love past the thresholds where permission ended. Midwives were punished for failed births. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit chamber, its single window shuttered against the chill of the night. A woman lies on a straw-stuffed mattress, her face pale, her breathing ragged. Near the foot of the bed, a midwife kneels, her hands steady despite the weight of expectation pressing down upon her. In this moment, she carries not only the fragile hope of a new life but the unspoken threat of blame should anything go wrong. For much of history, midwives held a role that was both indispensable and precarious. They were the trusted guides through childbirth, the keepers of remedies, prayers, and inherited knowledge. In communities where no physician was available, And even where physicians practiced but preferred not to attend births, midwives were essential. Yet their work was shadowed by the ever-present possibility of tragedy. When a birth ended in death, grief was often joined by suspicion. A mother lost to fever or bleeding, a child stillborn, silent in the midwife's hands. These losses, so common in a world without sanitation or modern medicine, became fertile ground for accusations. Neighbors whispered that perhaps the midwife had erred in some hidden way, given the wrong herbs, spoken the wrong words, invoked powers she ought never to have touched. Imagine the quiet terror that settled over a midwife in the hours after a failed birth. As she gathered her tools, linen cloths, wooden bowls, small packets of dried plants, she knew that every gesture might later be recounted with suspicion. Even an attempt to ease a mother's suffering could be twisted into evidence of malice or witchcraft. The rhythm of their lives was shaped by this uneasy duality, to be respected as a healer and feared as someone who knew too much. In many communities, midwives were believed to hold special knowledge not only of life but of the hidden forces that governed health and misfortune. A birth gone wrong offered a potent opportunity to accuse, to deflect grief into blame. Sometimes the charges were of simple incompetence, a failure to act quickly enough, a misjudgment of a labor's progress. These accusations might result in fines, exile, or the loss of the midwife's right to practice. But in other cases, darker suspicions took hold. People believed that a midwife could call upon unholy powers, could curse the child or mother, could twist the natural order through secret rites. In parts of Europe, these beliefs were given legal force. Midwives were among those most often named in witch trials. Their knowledge of herbs and remedies became proof of unnatural influence. Their presence at so many births became evidence that they must also preside over death. Under the pressure of interrogation, some confessed to impossible crimes, claiming they had sealed the womb by incantation or offered infants to demonic patrons. Imagine the toll this took on a woman who had spent her life in service. One night, she might be called to aid a neighbor in labor. The next, she could find herself dragged before a magistrate, forced to answer for forces beyond anyone's understanding or control. In some cases, these proceedings were mere formalities, the outcome predetermined. Fines, public humiliation, or banishment were common. And in the worst instances, execution by burning or hanging ended a life spent in the service of others. Even in communities less inclined to invoke witchcraft, a midwife could face severe penalties. In certain towns, regulations required that any death in childbirth be investigated. Midwives might be required to testify under oath, to detail each step they took, each word they spoke. Any inconsistency could be interpreted as guilt. The burden of proof rested not on the accuser, but on the midwife herself, an impossible standard in a time when so little about childbirth was understood. And yet, despite the danger, women continued to take up the work. The rhythm of their lives was punctuated by urgent knocks on the door, by whispered pleas for help in the darkest hours of night. Midwives often accepted little payment, sometimes only a meal, a piece of cloth, or the gratitude of a family who had survived. Their reward was not security but the knowledge that their skill could save lives, even if the risk of accusation never disappeared. Imagine the contrast between the quiet patience of the birthing room and the harsh scrutiny of the courtroom. In the chamber, a midwife's hands moved with calm certainty, her voice low and steady. She offered reassurance, adjusted a blanket, checked the baby's progress with practiced fingers. In the courtroom, those same hands were regarded with suspicion, her knowledge recast as dangerous cunning. For the families, these trials were often as unsettling as the tragedy itself. A woman who had once been a trusted helper became a figure of fear. Neighbors who had watched her skill with admiration might now look away, unwilling to speak in her defense. Communities that depended on her were, paradoxically, the first to condemn her. The rhythm of their lives left little room for reflection. New births demanded attention. New families called upon the same midwives whose reputations had been tarnished only months before. Necessity overcame fear, at least until the next death stirred suspicion again. In wealthier circles, physicians increasingly inserted themselves into childbirth, offering the promise of more scientific oversight. Yet even they could do little to improve outcomes without antiseptics or an understanding of infection. And when a birth ended in tragedy under a physician's care, it was still the midwife who was blamed, her presence invoked as an explanation for any failure. Even now, you can almost imagine the hush that followed a difficult delivery. The mother's breathing slowing, the child still and silent. The midwife gathering her few belongings, aware that she might be called to account for what no one could prevent. It is a quiet truth, repeated across generations. These women stood watch at the threshold of life and death. They brought skill and courage into rooms where others dared not tread. And when fate turned cruel, it was often they who paid the price. In the end, the rhythm of their lives was a constant negotiation, between service and suspicion, between hope and fear, between the need to help and the danger of being blamed. Their story is woven through history like a hidden thread, a testament to the resilience of those who dared to guide new life into a world that did not always thank them for it. Plague wiped out whole families overnight. Imagine yourself walking down a narrow, cobbled street in a medieval town, the morning air heavy with mist and the scent of damp straw. The houses lean toward each other, their wooden beams groaning with age. Life here follows familiar rhythms, vendors calling out the price of fish, children slipping past with baskets, the blacksmith's hammer ringing out across the square. But just beyond these ordinary sounds lies an unease that everyone feels but no one can name out loud. In times when plague arrived, it did so with a quiet, invisible force. There were no warnings carved in the sky, no signs pinned to doorways until it was already too late. Often, it began with something so small it went unnoticed. A flea, carried in the fur of a rat, finding its way onto a blanket or a sleeve. That single bite, no more remarkable in the moment than the sting of a nettle, might set in motion the end of an entire household. Imagine the first signs. A fever that did not break, a headache so fierce it left the sufferer unable to rise from bed. The family would gather close, offering sips of broth, pressing damp cloths to a brow. No one thought to stay away. How could they? Care was an instinct as familiar as breathing. And so, with every touch, the contagion spread. A cough released it into the air. A shared cup carried it to the next mouth. By the time the neighbors heard whispers of sickness, the house itself had become a sealed chamber of fate. When plague truly took hold, it moved with a speed and certainty that defied understanding. One day, a child might be playing near the threshold. The next, they would lie motionless under rough-spun blankets. Parents who had held vigil through the night would soon find their own strength failing. Each hour brought fresh symptoms, chills, weakness, swellings along the neck and underarms. The rhythm of life collapsed into a single question: who would be left by dawn? In some villages, entire families vanished in the span of a week. A household that had stood for generations was reduced to silence, its hearth cold, its doors left ajar. Neighbors, themselves afraid, might step carefully inside to see if anyone survived. They moved quickly, taking what food remained, marking the lintel with a sign that no one wished to see, a crude cross or a smear of lime, warning others to keep their distance. Imagine the hush that settled over these places, the uneasy quiet that followed so much sudden loss. Streets that once bustled with voices were left almost deserted. Windows stayed shuttered. A single cough in the distance could make an entire lane tense with dread. Even churches fell still, their bells tolling more often for the dead than for any living celebration. In wealthier homes, physicians sometimes arrived clad in long cloaks and masks shaped like bird beaks, stuffed with pungent herbs meant to ward off the infection. But even these precautions often failed. Knowledge was limited, and the tools of medicine could do little against a sickness that traveled so easily. It was not uncommon for a doctor to tend a patient in the morning and be laid out himself before the week had ended. Communities devised their own rituals to cope with the terror. Some families burned herbs to cleanse the air, while others painted protective symbols on doorframes. In certain towns, watchmen stood at the outskirts to bar anyone from entering or leaving. Isolation became a desperate strategy, one that saved some and condemned others to die alone. Despite the fear, small acts of kindness persisted. A neighbor might leave bread and water at a doorstep, knocking once before slipping away. Priests, though often as frightened as everyone else, came to murmur final prayers when they could. These gestures, quiet and unrecorded, were sometimes the only comfort in a time when whole households disappeared almost without trace. The speed with which plague erased generations left a mark deeper than statistics could capture. Entire family lines ended overnight. Small children were left orphaned, sometimes wandering into the care of strangers or slipping away themselves. Property changed hands not through inheritance but by necessity, as survivors pieced together a semblance of order from so much sudden vacancy. Imagine the slow return of life in the aftermath. Fields grew wild because there were too few hands to harvest them. Shops remained closed. Birds nested in empty attics. It could take years for a village to recover even a fraction of its former population. The memory of that quiet devastation lingered in every story, every cautionary tale whispered to the next generation. Over time, the causes of plague became better understood. Gradually, knowledge about sanitation, quarantine, and the true carriers of disease reshaped how communities prepared. But for the many who had already lived through its swift, merciless course, these insights arrived too late. Their losses remained woven into the landscape itself: the abandoned cottages, the overgrown churchyards, the gaps in family trees. This was the rhythm of their lives, an unsteady balance between ordinary days and the ever-present possibility that everything could vanish in the space of a week. In the flickering candlelight of those long nights, each family waited, hoping that by some mercy they would be spared. As you let your thoughts drift, you can picture those silent streets, the closed doors, the small gestures of care in the face of fear. Though plague came as an unseen force, it revealed the fragile threads that bound people to one another, the shared breath, the touch of a hand, the simple will to stand by loved ones even when the cost was unimaginable. Their quiet endurance remains one of history's most sobering legacies, and perhaps also one of its most human. Orphans were turned into laborers immediately. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a village square on a pale, windy morning. The stones underfoot are cold. A small crowd gathers in quiet clusters, their voices low and subdued. At the center stands a local official with a ledger in one hand and a quill in the other. Beside him, several children stand in a nervous row. Their eyes flick back and forth, searching for some sign of what will happen next. These children are orphans. In the medieval world and well into the early modern period, the death of a parent, especially both parents, was not a rare tragedy. Plague, famine, war, and childbirth took lives swiftly. Communities had no social safety net as we know it today. No welfare programs or universal charities guaranteed shelter or care. Instead, children who had lost their families became, almost immediately, a burden to be redistributed. Imagine the hush that would fall over the village when news spread that a household had been struck down by illness. Neighbors might step in to bury the dead and gather what belongings could be salvaged. But then, almost at once, came the question of what to do with the children. Who would take them in? Who could afford another mouth to feed? In most places, sentiment came second to survival. In many towns, orphans were offered up for service, sometimes through a formal auction, sometimes through a quieter arrangement called an indenture. The officials would list each child's age, health, and any small skills they might possess. A girl of 10 who could spin wool, a boy of 8 who might learn to tend sheep or carry water. Their futures depended less on who was kind and more on who was willing to house and clothe them in exchange for labor. If you picture the scene, you can almost hear the shuffling of feet as potential masters stepped forward. They would ask a few questions, lift a chin to inspect a child's face, prod a shoulder to judge strength. The official would record the agreement in careful script. For the child, there was little say in the matter. Often, these arrangements were called apprenticeships, though the term did not always mean learning a trade in the sense we imagine today. True apprentices, those bound to skilled artisans, might eventually inherit tools and knowledge. But many orphans were simply taken as domestic servants or farmhands. A small contract would stipulate how many years the child must serve and what they would receive: a bed, simple clothing, and, perhaps, a modest payment at the end of their term. In practice, these promises were fragile. A child might be fed and given shelter, but affection was rarely guaranteed. Some masters treated orphans with a degree of stern kindness, seeing them as part of the household. Others regarded them as property, a resource to be used up and discarded. Imagine a small boy waking before dawn in a drafty loft, pulling on rough-spun clothes stiff with drying rain. His work began before first light, feeding livestock, hauling water, cleaning tools. For some, there was little distinction between childhood and adulthood. The moment a child could carry a bucket or hold a broom, they were expected to contribute. In cities, orphan children sometimes entered workshops, where they learned to weave, carve, or smith. These trades could provide a path to modest independence, though the road was long. The hours were punishing, the masters exacting. A child might spend years sleeping on a pallet near the hearth, rising each day to perform the same motions over and over until skill grew from repetition. Meanwhile, girls were often placed in domestic service, tending to fires, scrubbing floors, or caring for their master's younger children. Some became wet nurses if they were old enough and had already borne children themselves. Others spent their days carding wool or mending clothes in dim back rooms. Their labor was taken for granted, and any protest was met with a reminder: without this arrangement, they might have no roof at all. Yet even in these harsh circumstances, orphans found ways to endure. In the evenings, after the work was done, they might gather in corners of the kitchen or stable, sharing scraps of bread or whispering stories. Bonds formed between those who had no families of their own. A small kindness, an older servant slipping a tired child a crust of cheese, could become a memory that lingered for a lifetime. Parish records, when you read them carefully, tell these stories in quiet fragments. A name written beside the word apprenticed, a note about clothing allotted each year, an entry marking the end of service when the child turned 14 or 15. Sometimes the record ended abruptly, with no explanation, just a line drawn through a name, hinting at another life lost to illness or accident. Over time, some communities developed almshouses or orphanages where children were housed collectively. Yet even these institutions relied on labor to sustain themselves. Orphans were expected to work in gardens, kitchens, or workshops in exchange for their care. Charity, when it existed, was seldom free of obligation. Imagine now, as dusk settles over the village square, the final agreements are made. The children are led away, some looking back over their shoulders for a familiar face that never appears. The ledger is closed. The crowd disperses, footsteps fading into the quiet of evening. In that moment, a life has been decided by necessity. A child's world has narrowed to the walls of a stranger's household. Today, we might feel sorrow or anger at such a system. Yet in a world without predictable harvests or modern institutions, survival often demanded these choices. People did what they believed they must. And orphans themselves learned to adapt, to find small comforts and fragments of belonging wherever they could. So as you let your thoughts drift, consider how these children faced each day, with a resilience they never chose and a quiet acceptance of work as the price of existence. The simplicity of survival left little room for sentiment. Yet in the spaces between labor and obligation, they still found moments of childhood, a quick game played in a dusty yard, a song hummed while scrubbing pots, a fleeting hope that tomorrow might bring something kinder. In the hush that follows, imagine the ledger resting on the official's desk, its pages filled with names. Each name once belonged to a child standing in that cold square, waiting to learn which door would open to receive them. In their stories, we glimpse both the harshness of history and the unbreakable threads of endurance woven through even the smallest lives. Illegitimate children had no inheritance and no future. Imagine yourself stepping into the cool interior of a medieval hall, where the stone walls are draped in faded tapestries depicting the lineage of a noble house. Each figure in the tapestry holds a shield or a crest, a visual claim to inheritance and legitimacy. You might notice how every name is carefully stitched in place, one generation linked to the next in an unbroken line. Yet beyond these embroidered ancestors lay a different reality. Children born without a place in such histories, their names seldom recorded, their futures quietly constrained before they ever spoke their first words. In the social order of medieval and early modern Europe, legitimacy was more than a legal formality, it was the foundation of identity, status, and hope. A child born outside of wedlock carried a mark that could not easily be removed. No matter how beloved they were by their parents, no matter how capable or honest, their birth alone defined the limits of their possibilities. Inheritance was the most visible barrier. Land was the bedrock of wealth and influence, and only children recognized by both parents, especially the father, could claim it. Even small plots were guarded by customs designed to ensure clear succession. If you were illegitimate, you had no legal right to your father's holdings. Your mother's family might take you in, but their resources were often meager. Some fathers attempted to leave provisions through gifts or annuities, but these were easily contested by legitimate heirs or ignored altogether. Imagine a young boy growing up in a cottage on the edge of a village. His father visits occasionally, offering quiet gestures of affection, a loaf of bread, a small wooden toy. But when the father dies, the boy's connection to him dissolves like breath in winter air. There is no seat for him at the family table, no portion of land or livestock, no acknowledgement in the parish register beyond a note that he was born without marriage. His future narrows to a single path, laboring for others. The stigma followed such children wherever they went. Guilds, powerful associations of craftsmen and merchants, rarely admitted anyone whose birth was in doubt. To join a guild meant stability, training, and respect. To be denied entry was to be consigned to casual work, seasonal hiring, and dependence. Even in trades where skill could shine through, an illegitimate apprentice might face suspicion or scorn. The word bastard was not merely descriptive, it was a quiet verdict on one's worth. Marriage, too, became a kind of negotiation fraught with obstacles. Families sought alliances that enhanced property, status, or reputation. To marry well, one needed a name unclouded by controversy. Many who were born out of wedlock could only marry within their own constrained circle, other laborers or servants, other people without claim to inheritance. While affection certainly existed in these unions, the freedom to choose without calculation was rare. Even the church, which in theory welcomed all souls equally, often reflected and reinforced these social boundaries. Though baptism was available to every child, and the priest might offer the same blessings over the font, the stigma remained in parish records and in communal memory. Some communities believed that illegitimacy was a sign of moral failing that could echo across generations. Inheritance laws and social customs alike reinforced the idea that a family's dishonor was as enduring as its bloodline. Imagine the rhythm of their lives, the children running errands in market streets, the young men taking work as farmhands or porters, the women laboring in kitchens or spinning rooms. They learned early how to read the subtle signs of judgment, a neighbor's withheld greeting, a merchant's narrowed glance, a suitor's sudden hesitation upon learning of their birth. These moments were not always loud, but they were persistent, like a draft that slips under the door no matter how tightly it is barred. Yet even within these constraints, many found ways to build a life. Some rose by force of will and talent alone, accumulating modest savings or earning a reputation that overcame prejudice. Others were fortunate to have parents or patrons willing to advocate on their behalf. In rare cases, a king or lord would issue letters of legitimation, formally erasing the stain of illegitimacy. But such gestures were uncommon, often reserved for those whose skills or alliances proved useful to the powerful. Over time, laws evolved. In some regions, statutes softened the absolute barriers to inheritance, allowing acknowledged children limited rights if no legitimate heirs existed. But these changes came slowly and unevenly, and for centuries, the reality remained unchanged for most. An illegitimate birth meant a lifetime of reduced prospects. If you picture a small cottage at dusk, you might see a mother sitting by the hearth, mending a shirt by lamplight. Her child sleeps nearby, unaware of the invisible wall already shaping his future. Outside, the great houses stand behind their gates, their heirs secure in the knowledge that their place in the world is assured by birth alone. Inside the cottage, the hope of something better persists, quiet but resilient. As you reflect on this, consider how much of history was built on invisible hierarchies, unspoken rules about who belonged, who deserved, and who must remain on the margins. Inheritance, guild membership, marriage, each was a doorway that could be locked before a child ever learned to walk. And yet, amid these locked doors, there were always small acts of defiance. Parents who insisted on loving their children openly, neighbors who looked beyond a name, and individuals who found worth in themselves when the world refused to grant it. Let yourself drift into that world for a moment longer. Feel the hush of evening in the village, the pale glow of lanterns, the hush of wind against shuttered windows. Even in lives bounded by the circumstances of birth, there was dignity, a quiet persistence, a determination to endure. And as you return to your own time, you might carry with you a gentle recognition of all those who once lived in the shadows of inheritance and respectability, their futures uncertain but their humanity undiminished. Fathers had legal power to marry off their children without consent. Imagine yourself in a timbered hall warmed by the glow of a single hearth. The air is thick with the scent of wool cloaks drying by the fire and the faint sweetness of ale left in pewter cups. On a long table, parchments are spread in careful rows, marriage contracts inked in a practiced hand, each one charting the fates of children who have no voice in the matter. In many societies across medieval and early modern Europe, the power to arrange a marriage belonged almost exclusively to the father. His authority was both cultural and legal, woven into the laws of inheritance, property, and feudal allegiance. A child's future, who they would share their days with, where they would live, and what alliances their union might secure, was determined less by affection than by necessity. To understand this world, picture a father seated at the head of the table, his face shadowed by candlelight. In one hand, he holds a folded letter bearing the seal of a neighboring lord. The letter proposes a match between his daughter, who is perhaps no more than 12, and a young man she has never met. The reasons are laid out in plain, courteous language. The uniting of two small estates, the easing of a long-standing feud, the promise of greater security for both families. There is no mention of consent. No one asks whether the girl wishes it. In the eyes of the law, the father's decision was binding. Even when the child was barely old enough to understand the implications, the agreement was valid. Canon law recognized the importance of consent in theory, but in practice, that consent was often assumed, implied, or ignored. A nod, a lowered gaze, or simple silence could be construed as agreement. The pressure to accept was immense, and few dared to question it. Imagine a young boy of 14, brought into the hall to be told he would marry the daughter of a local merchant. He might stand awkwardly, his hands clasped behind his back, while the adults discussed terms over his head. Perhaps he would catch fragments of conversation, mentions of dowry, her father's debts, the prospects of a small herd of sheep to be transferred as part of the arrangement. His own feelings were irrelevant, folded away like a scrap of paper no one would bother to read. For fathers, the stakes were high. Marriage was not only a personal affair but a public transaction. The right alliance could mean survival in lean seasons, protection from rivals, or elevation in the fragile web of status that defined medieval life. A miscalculation, a poorly chosen match, an insufficient dowry, a bride perceived as lacking virtue, could plunge a family into years of hardship or disgrace. Sometimes, arrangements were made when children were still in the cradle. Betrothal contracts could be drawn up before the child could walk, with the understanding that the marriage would be completed at a later age. In some regions, these contracts were so common that they became a kind of insurance, a way to secure the family's future while the world around them remained unpredictable. Picture the quiet domestic moments these decisions overshadowed. A girl helping her mother spin wool, glancing up each time a rider approached the gate, wondering if this would be the day news arrived about her future. A boy practicing his letters by the fire, unaware that a distant relative had already arranged the course of his life. These small, unremarkable scenes were threaded through with an unspoken understanding. Their lives were not wholly their own. Even among the nobility, where wealth softened certain hardships, children rarely escaped this fate. A daughter's marriage might be arranged to cement a treaty or secure a contested parcel of land. In royal circles, the stakes were higher still. Dynasties hinged on these unions, and children became instruments of policy, valuable, sometimes expendable, rarely consulted. Over time, some regions and legal traditions began to acknowledge the importance of the child's will. The Church, in particular, insisted that valid marriages required free consent, spoken aloud. But the power dynamics were uneven. A father's authority, and the pressure of obedience, could make refusal nearly impossible. Imagine the day of such a marriage. The church is cool and dim, the air faintly scented with incense. The bride stands beside her father, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles pale. When the priest asks if she consents, her voice is scarcely more than a whisper. Perhaps it is enough. Perhaps no one dares to notice the tremor in it. The words are recorded, the marriage sealed, the witnesses satisfied that all has been done properly. These decisions left lasting marks. Some unions proved gentle and companionable, growing into quiet affection. Others were fraught with resentment, the memory of that first day lingering like a shadow. For those who found themselves bound to a stranger, the rhythms of daily life offered little escape. A young wife might spend her days tending livestock or managing a kitchen, her thoughts returning again and again to what might have been. Gradually, change came. Enlightenment philosophers began to argue that marriage without true consent was no marriage at all. Legal reforms slowly raised the minimum ages and introduced clearer requirements for mutual agreement. But for countless generations, the custom endured. Fathers continued to see their children's futures as extensions of their own ambitions, their own fears, their own strategies for survival. Imagine yourself standing at the threshold of that timbered hall once more. The fire burns low, and the table is cleared of parchment. In the quiet that follows, you can almost hear the echoes of all those decisions, the whispered negotiations, the soft sighs of resignation, the unspoken hope that what had been arranged might, in time, become something gentler. And so, when you reflect on this chapter of the past, remember that history is shaped not only by battles and treaties but by the quieter transactions carried out behind closed doors. Transactions that charted the courses of young lives, binding them to strangers, to obligations, and to a future they were given no power to choose. In these stories, you glimpse both the harsh necessity and the resilience that have always marked the human experience, even in the smallest corners of the world.